Teresa Lilly, thank you so much for joining us on the People Leader Accelerator Podcast. You're joining us from Australia, and it's very early in the morning. Is that right?
That's right. It is 7 a.m. and the sun is just rising behind me. So you'll see that come up as we keep talking.
We were joking before the recording officially started that you actually went through the People Leader Accelerator program 5+ years ago, and it was much earlier in the morning for you then. We used to see the sunrise in the room that you were in. And, I continue to think of that as an example of your commitment to personal and professional growth and development. And it's just been fantastic to follow you and your progress over the past few years as you've built this really amazing career influencing others and influencing the HR and tech community down under. But would you give a more thorough explanation of your career and who you are?
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm from the US originally, but I relocated to Australia, to Sydney 10 years ago. So in terms of my career journey, I actually started in a very non-traditional HR path. I studied French in university, and I was always really interested in cultures and how you could go to a different country and people would see the same thing entirely differently, and also how language reflected that. So I always was really interested in that human experience, and had the opportunity when I was living in Boston to join my first startup about 12 years ago. And I was asked to come in and help with the people stuff. And I was like, what is this people stuff? I don't know if I really like that. I don't want to be the police. I was just very anti me, but I got into that people space and absolutely loved it. I think that intersection of organizational behavior, change management, leadership development, it was really exciting. And I was like, I think I found my space. So I've been in high growth tech startups, leading them for the past 12 years and done everything from seed to Series D. So seen an enormous amount of change and kind of that journey as you go through the different phases. And now I've actually moved to consulting and advisory work. So advising back into startups and scale-ups, which has been a really fun progression in my career.
One other thing that I noticed about your background that was fascinating are the industries that you worked in. Could you share just a little bit about the variety of industries that you've touched?
Yeah, I've been in some really interesting ones. So started in health, had a few health stints, which I really enjoy, but I was in a Web3 sneakers kind of Pokemon Go-esque game startup, which was really interesting. I've been in superannuation, which is the Australian 401k retirement fund. So back end, really archaic, slow moving industry. And I've been in an AI company as well, so in medical AI company. So very progressive. So it's been interesting to be in the cutting edge of technology, and then ones where you're trying to bring innovation to really archaic, old school industries as well.
I think one of the things that's so interesting about that variety is that you've spent so much time inside of change and trying to do change in different types of environments. When you look back at that, what are some of the things that are through line in being able to successfully change an organization? And what are some things that need to be nuanced about it?
A lot comes down to appetite and readiness from the leaders in terms of what change you can make. I think in terms of how to navigate change, what's been really key is you have to bring people on the journey. You need to win their hearts and minds along the change journey. So I think you can approach it in a lot of different ways. You can kind of take it sledgehammer, this just needs to happen, leaders mandate from above. And while you might get lip service, you will have a lot of people resist change in different ways. And so they might not actually they'll kind of subvert the change. And then I've also seen, change can happen too gradually. So leaders, don't want to upset things too much. So it's kind of dribbled down over a really long period of time. And people tend to get numb. They're like, we've been in this constant dribble of change for a period of time. I'm just tuning it out. And so I think it's getting that right balance of trying to be strategic, but also be really human through the change. And I think transparency is a really key thing to drive that and to make sure you are winning the hearts and minds and providing that context of why do we need a change and this is what's happening. So bringing that story to the forefront.
Where do you see people leaders most often underestimate that emotional or relational element or cost of sustained change?
Yeah, I think we can sometimes get caught up in the process of change. And so we forget about the emotional hangover of change. And that's probably because a lot of times the people leaders, we're privy to the change pretty early on. We've gone through our own journey and we're navigating it. So I think where it can fall down is when as a people leader, you forget that you need to give people that time to maybe grieve a change and a loss. So I've been through a number of different companies. One of my most recent companies, we actually went through a founder change. So founder exited the business 3 weeks after I joined unexpectedly. And that was a real big pivotal moment for the business and the company, because a lot of people had joined a founder-led business. They want to be a part of that. And so navigating that change, it took time. That's the other thing, is like a lot of times leaders are like, we've done the change. Let's just get on with things. Let's get back to business. And there's an element that, yes, that's important, but also you have to accept that like people might not be at 100% for a period of time, especially if they've lost colleagues or leadership has changed, because that style just trickles down. And I think a part of that is, people like, well, how do I do well here? Because how the previous leader defined that is actually maybe very different from the incoming leader, because oftentimes that's driven very much from the top in terms of what success looks like.
How long do you let people grieve a change? Because like at some point there is a like, yeah, let's get on with it. But how do you know when is appropriate, especially when it's an organization and some people are like, no biggie, here I go. And other people might take much longer to get comfortable with the fact that, yeah, I lost colleagues, or I really like that founder, or whatever the change happened to be.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a time per se, but I think this is kind of where the manager is really, really critical in navigating those conversations. The best managers, what they do is they get people back to doing the things that they love, that really brings them joy, and also like getting their arms around the team and building connection. So I think those are often the things that help people navigate the changes, the joy of the work and the connection with others, kind of like can ride through. In terms of timing, it just depends on what it is, to be honest. Like going through a significant change, like I was saying with like a founder, CEO change, honestly, I'd say that's like a year, like at least 6 months. But in terms of people trying to understand what is this new normal and this new paradigm that we're in, if you go through any restructures, that's a huge change as well. And I think there's evidence that it can take sometimes up to 18 months for people to get back to a good place. I think it depends on what it is, but I find that if you get around it really quickly and address the emotions early, and that's at that manager level. So as a people leader, it's helping your managers have those conversations, discuss the white elephant, discuss the emotions early on, get everybody together and just sit with that and get people back to doing the things that they love. A lot of times that is enough to get them over the hurdle. And then understanding that some people do maybe decide that this change isn't for them. And so that's fine too. And so you want to like just shorten that loop as much as you can.
We are so grounded in the practical and operational aspects of the role. And, of course, everything about PLA also has the management theory and research behind it. But like people want to understand, so what should I do? So what are the actions I should take? Like, what is the project plan when the cheese has been moved or when the big cheese is no longer with the organization? I just did a project for a client, a private equity-backed organization, had a longtime CEO depart. And they retained me, even though they had a VP level HR leader, to help them think through, okay, now what do we do? They were comfortable running a search for a new leader, but who needs to be communicated to? In what order? In what way? Like, what's the script that we use? What's the email that we send? Oh my goodness, we didn't even think about contacting our customers and our suppliers along the way, or maybe our lenders. And so I kind of mapped out all that for them. But I'm wondering, as we talk about change and the human resources leader's role in managing that and helping our businesses to optimize performance, do you have any specific suggestions about like how to approach that might be a little bit more practical, tactical, operational?
Yeah. I think if you are in a small to medium sized business, good chance that the change manager is you. It's you. So Andrew, exactly what you said, you kind of have your different stakeholder groups and you can do a bit of an assessment around like your readiness and appetite for change. So how across this are they? Is this new? And what is that journey like? And those different communication streams. One thing that I do really like using are guides to help managers have those conversations. You can do FAQs and that helps to an extent, but I do think it's about equipping the managers to have more of those nuanced conversations. So that's a key component with stakeholders. It's like, you have your priority order of this change hits, and particularly with the CEO change, it is like bang, everything needs to be really sequenced in terms of who's notified and who is doing the notification as well, and what their role is to play. So it's a lot of people leader. You are the scripter. You might have the luxury of somebody else who can partner with you, maybe a chief of staff, or, if like a head of marketing can help as well. But oftentimes you are doing the scripting as well. And so you're kind of that ghostwriter through the change. And I think a lot of times people don't maybe know that because it's never been explicit. It's not part of your JD at all. And I think that's one thing I found with a lot of changes. People can mistakenly assume that somebody has thought of the gaps and they're like, oh, definitely like that leader has thought of how this is going to play out. And I found if you ask questions around those gaps, usually you'll find that nobody has thought about it, or they've thought about it, but not done anything about it. And so I think you're bringing that whole orchestration together in the change. And so there's different components. So whether it's like in your executive team, you're coaching them about what to say and how to connect with the employees and where they might be at. You're also feeding them that employee sentiment. And hopefully you have ears on the ground to understand, what are people worried about? I'm working with a client at the moment that's gone through a big leadership change recently, and we've run a number of Ask Me Anything sessions. And it's been totally unmoderated, which has been really interesting. So we just literally anonymous questions, boom, no moderation. And the point of that was try to build transparency through the change and to really surface those conversations. Because what you don't want in change is that everybody's having those concerned conversations in kind of the shadows of the company. You want to bring that to the forefront. You want to bring that to the town hall forum so that you can just speak really openly and address people's concerns. Also provide clarity of direction, because that's ultimately what people are looking for through change. Like, where are we headed and why? And then how are we going to get there? And so as a people leader, that's your job, is actually to coach the leaders to make sure their messaging is touching on those points.
I love that, Teresa. The clarity along the way, the coordination of the communications, lots of C's here. Clarity, coordination, change. I'd imagine mapping out who are the stakeholders, who gets communicated to, when, what is the general message? Can we be synced up and coordinated on those key messages? Just having someone kind of hold the reins or manage the project of the internal communications. I like to think of internal communications as being the magic wand of HR. Rarely do we get a full-time headcount that can do that for us. And most of the time when we do have a full-time headcount, they can't do it for us because they're not in the same meetings and they don't have the same perspective that the head of HR does. So that's such an influential, impactful role that we as the HR leaders can play to help an org maximize its effectiveness through change. We've talked about change, and you're doing consulting in that space. In terms of advice and perspective for our audience, which tends to be mid to senior level people leaders that want to have a career like yours, that want to grow quickly, become the head of the function someday, often the relationship between the HR leader and the CEO is what really defines your role and your success in that role. Could you share a little bit more for our listeners about just how that works, how to know when it's working and how to shape it when it may not be working? But let's dig in there in terms of the HR leader and CEO relationship.
I think out of all the executive roles, the HR role is most sensitive to that relationship with the CEO. You can have a chief product officer that maybe they aren't super aligned with the CEO, but there's a lot of other things that kind of factor into that CPO being in seat. But the head of HR, it is 80%, 90% relational with that CEO. So in terms of what works is if you have a CEO who understands how critical it is to have a motivated and high-performing organization and how to get there, a lot of your work is done. If you have a CEO that sees HR as a necessary evil, compliance, regulation focused role, you have a really steep uphill battle on your hands to just win them over, winning their hearts and minds to what HR can bring to the space. When I have been able to have the most influence is when the CEO gets the space and understands that how people are so critical to the business's success. And I think probably addressing it more as a taking more of a carrot than a stick approach to people and wanting to think about like, how do we unblock people to do their best work versus the inverse is how do we control and have oversight of all that they're doing, and more of that stick approach. And if they're not doing what we need them to do, we go after them. So in terms of the relationship, I actually think I heard this from the CPO of Coinbase. We said like, get to your crucible moment very quickly when you join. And I couldn't agree more. I think you want to kind of stress test that relationship quickly. And I think earlier in my career probably was a little bit more, I didn't know how to stress test it. Now I get there really quickly, like within the first month or two. And what that means is the minute that we're at a point of conflict around how to approach a decision, I make sure to share, my perspective and see how they respond to it. And how can we work through that if we're coming at it from different points? Can we both take each other's point of view, maybe find a compromise, or maybe we lean one way or the other? Earlier in my career, I would have been a little bit cautious to share my opinion early. Another thing that I really like to do is I like to give them feedback early on that's negative, if there's negative feedback to give. And I know that this is maybe a little controversial, but it's coming from a good place. I think any feedback, it's like you want this person to be a better leader. And so if you're coming at it from, I want you to be a better leader. So recently I was working with the CEO and he just didn't come across in the best way to employees through a change piece. So quite negative and demotivating. And so I was like, okay, button up, I'm going to need to give him feedback, because I'm guessing the other thing is like, usually your CEOs and execs, they never get feedback. That's critical. It's very rare. Anyway, so I went to the CEO and I said, these are the things that you do really well, and you're at your best when you are painting this vision. And I said, you're also really strong in writing. But when you went up in front of everybody, what you had put in writing did not come across in that meeting. And they felt deflated. And it was quite a negative message for just trying to highlight some good work and what you want to see people do more of. And he just took it really in stride and was so positive, and said like, oh, thank you so much. And like, just keep it up. So that was an example of it going really well. Now, I've definitely had other examples where it hasn't gone well. And then you do end up in this position where you're like, okay, so if I have somebody who isn't willing to receive feedback, how influential am I actually going to be in this role with this person? But if you both are not able to take on feedback from each other, I actually think that relationship is destined for friction. And it's destined for you to be sidelined. You will never have that strategic influence that you want, because you're not in that arena of having that robust discussion with your CEO. So those are some things that I think learnings around how important that relationship is. But I think it also comes down to your values but also your beliefs about people. Like some executives might have a belief that people are able to do amazing things if we just back them. That could be a belief that they have. Another belief might be you can't trust people. Like by default, people are not trustworthy and they are going to try to undermine you and take advantage of you. That's a belief. So I think trying to understand what belief system your CEO has, and then does that align with your belief system, that is going to make all the difference. Because if you are aligned on beliefs, you're just going to be able to do so much more and have such a bigger impact. Whereas if you are misaligned, instead of actually talking about the issue of whatever it is, like whether you should track people's time or be really fickle about expenses and policies, it actually comes down to your belief as if you trust people or not. You end up just having these discussions around the issue, but underpinning that is a much deeper thing.
As I think about it, it's really helpful to have those articulated of these beliefs and understanding, what does your CEO believe? What do I, as a head of people, believe? The idea that it can be 100% overlap seems hard. And so how do you know if you're seeing signs of misalignment, like they're not taking my feedback or I have a different belief than them? At what point is this like a lost cause, not the place for me? And at what point is this like, hey, maybe I need to come at it from another angle, or I need to try again, or I need to give it more time? What are some of the elements that somebody might think about on that weighing of, is it fixable? Is it savable or not?
You're never going to have 100% alignment. Absolutely. What I would say is, what are you up for? And how much are you willing to morph and change as necessary? Because actually that's what the change oftentimes needs to happen. It's not the CEO that's going to necessarily change. It's saying, how much are you willing to change your approach how much are you willing to compromise on things that you think are important? And then what are you being asked to do? So I was in a situation working with an executive where I was asked to do things that actually were unethical, sometimes unlawful. And it was like, okay, that's just a deal breaker for me, that no matter what, this is never going to work, because we fundamentally have a different view of how to treat people and also like the risk that we're willing to take with the business. So I think that's an extreme example where I could have contorted myself to accommodate those needs and that approach, but at great cost to my personal value and integrity. That's one thing I often think about, is like, how do you maintain your own humanity when you are in heads of HR roles? You have these like really confronting moments of like, how am I actually going to approach the situation that aligns with my values? So that's one thing, is just how much are you willing to move and adjust? And then at what cost is that to yourself? But sometimes it might be about your personality and style. So just like how you approach things, there's that whole spectrum of how casual, professional you need to be, how organized versus ad hoc you need to be. And it's understanding for yourself, what are you willing to tolerate? So that's probably what I would say, is actually it comes down to yourself, because you can't change other people. People decide what they do separately. So it's really deciding for yourself what you can work with. And then also, is this a place where you're going to be able to do the work that brings you energy and joy? And I guess that's the other kind of element of it.
Yeah, I love how you're personalizing it to the context and situation of the individual. One thing that you said that I think is very important to point out is you mentioned, don't expect the CEO to change. And I think that is often a misexpectation that I see of that. Like, this is a two-way street, like almost any other relationship in my life, work relationship, person, like the other person should meet me halfway, right? And I do think with many CEOs, especially founder CEOs, it is you'll be lucky if you get somebody who can change. That would be lovely. But the expectation that they will is probably not the correct one. And so I do want to double click on that one, because I think it's helpful to underline it for our audience of, don't expect the CEO to change. And that thinking about what your tolerance is for your own change is probably the more important element of this equation.
So in the last few years, I've really embraced the serenity prayer, around like understanding what you have the power to change and accepting the things that you don't and change what you can. So if you're expecting a CEO to change, you are going to be exhausted and disappointed. Not saying that they can't change, but they will follow their own course on that. It's really accepting like what's in your control and then adjusting that. And what's in your control is actually how you operate in that space and how you approach things. So that's why I'm saying in this case, you want to understand like, what are you willing to tolerate or not? I was actually at an HR conference yesterday. People were talking about all the things that frustrated them, and it was all out of their control. And so it's like, we can spend a lot of time in that space, but actually, what are we able to drive? What are we able to design? What are we able to change and influence? And also letting go that you might try to influence leaders or a situation and it doesn't go your way. And so it's like, well, you did your part, and I think that's all that you can do at the end. So there's a little bit of letting go. And it was interesting. I had a few difficult employee exits recently. It was kind of a blow up situation. And I was like, I cannot control how they're going to respond to the situation. All I can control is how we approach these conversations and the process of making sure we do right by the person and by the business. And then that blow up will just happen as it will happen.
Now, Teresa, as I think about what control do we actually have, it changes quite a bit moving from an in-house HR leader operator to a consultant fractional leader like you have been at different times during your career and are now. It seems like that's, the holy grail in some ways. Like, oh, I just wish I could get enough experience or enough financial security or enough confidence to be a consultant and be a fractional. Could you pull that apart a little bit for our listeners to like help them understand the pros and cons and the differences of being an in-house operator versus being a service provider like you are primarily today?
There's a lot of different models. I would preface this in terms of how you consult. So that varies. So at the moment, I'm doing fractional work. So fractional CPO for 2 different clients. And what I would say is that you do a full-time job in 3 days. So you have to be really, really efficient And relationship building is critical in any role. As a consultant, that time frame that you have to build relationships and trust is about 3 to 4 weeks. So it's just condensed, and that you need to be delivering value really quickly. So there's a lot of flexibility, but there's a lot of the expectation is higher in terms of how you operate. Another thing that's been interesting being across 2 clients is the context switching. You're learning businesses deeply and understanding the people deeply, and then you have to suddenly pull yourself out of one world and insert yourself into another world. That context switching is a key part of the role. In terms of how you have influence, it's been interesting. Your opinion goes pretty far pretty quickly in terms of, like they're having a consultant come in, they want to hear what you have to say. There's less earning that seat at the table. You're brought in as this expert. And so they're like, yep, tell me how it's done. And I think also, though, as part of having a lot of experience in the space, you can say, I have seen X, Y, and Z previously. These are the things that I'd watch out for. So you're backing up your opinion, not just with your opinion, but with expertise. The hard things is that in the people space, there's some things that are required, there's compliance and regulation, but there's a lot that is your personal flair about how you philosophically approach people. And so one thing that's interesting with one client I'm working with is that my philosophy and approach is quite different than the previous person they had in seat. And so the team's like, whoa, this is like totally different than what we were doing before. This is such a different way to approach these things. And they're like, but what's right? Or what's the long-term view of how we're going to build this people space and people strategy? So I think that's one thing that I found interesting, is that a lot of how you build your people strategy is based on the leader in seat understanding and interpreting the business strategy. And that tends to be based on your expertise and your philosophical view of how you think we can get there the best way through people. And so as a consultant, you're coming in for a period of time, and whether it's like a defined period or an extended, a lot of times people are like, okay, well, there's a lot of change. And a lot of times it's good change, but what happens when you leave? What is that going to look like? And so I think that's an interesting thing that I'm finding at the moment, is navigating that, like what happens when you step out? How do you transition out? And so whether that's you helping them hire in somebody, or you continue on in as an advisory capacity, like advisory, you can handhold a little bit more through that change so that it can be sustained. But if you are coming in, dropping in for a period of time, and then you are stepping out, the business might, depending on who comes into seat after you, there can be more change. So I think that's something that I just found is interesting. And people are like, how long are you here? How long are we going to be doing things in this way? So that's been an unexpected. But in terms of the variety is fantastic. It's super exciting. And then sometimes it's great because you might have a fire somewhere, and then you just drop out and you jump into another client and you're like, oh, no fires here, or like, not that fire, And so it's a little bit more compartmentalized in terms of what's going on, and less of an attachment to my identity to clients, So it's trying to really help them through something, but not bringing that home with me in the same way. So it's been an interesting change.
I have a very tactical question on how do you structure these 2 clients? Because you're mentioning dropping in and out and the context switching. I know there's some fractional CPOs who will have certain days of the week that they're with a client, and it's pretty bifurcated. But how are you structuring and thinking about your hours and that intermingling and trying to figure out how to do these full-time jobs in 3 days?
It's been a challenge. It is a bit of Tetris. So I do usually anchor days, 1 to 2 anchor days with the client where I'm on site with them. And then I have a couple of days, which is a bit of a hybrid. And those I do remote and kind of a mix of meetings across the different clients. Sometimes on my anchor days, I do need to have another client meeting because something urgent is happening. I actually have 2 different laptops. I'm packing in 2 laptops with me everywhere. That's been interesting. So that's how I'm structuring it at the moment. Now, is that the most optimal way to structure it? I don't know. I actually think if you are doing the fractional thing, it's probably easier to do one main client and then just advisory, rather than trying to do multiple fractional roles at the same time. Unless you have early stage, they just won't need a full-time version of you. So I can imagine if you're on an earlier stage startup fractionally, you could probably do a couple, and they're a couple 2 to 3 days a week, and you fill out your week that way. But if you are in a scale up, that is going to be a full-time compressed role. then you might want to think about advisory as your secondary rather than another scale. Definitely don't do two scale ups at the same time. That would be insane. So yeah, I think it just depends on how you structure it. If you're in pure advisory, you can have multiple clients because the demand is so different. If you are in that fractional space, so then I probably, just think about the stage of client and the need. Do they have a team? Do they not have a team? All those factors will impact your workload. And then do you have the hands to do the work? Because if you don't have the hands, guess what? That's actually you. So making sure you have the capacity for that.
Yeah. And are there thresholds or triggers at which point you might say to a client, hey, you actually need to graduate from a fractional person like me into a full-time operator to hold this role?
Yeah, I actually am having that conversation with one of my clients at the moment because they need somebody on the ground full time and quite much more operational, just in terms of the stage. They're an earlier stage company. And so I'm having that conversation. And initially they're like, what do you mean? Can't you just work more hours? I'm like, no. So, and I think it's like, how do you have those conversations in a really proactive way and then also help them through that transition? I think that's actually a natural evolution when you do come in fractionally. And so it's understanding and accepting that, like, when you're not able to meet their needs because of time, or maybe it's just not a good use of your time, you're like, actually, you could be paying someone less than what you're paying me and you're going to get more value. It's like actually having those conversations, because ultimately what you want to do is in the best interest of the business. And I think if you come at it from that place, like, founders really appreciate it and respect it. So, and then, you just move on to the next client and help them suss it out. What I found that really helps is if the founders don't actually know what they need, they don't understand the space. I think that's a really great time to bring in a fractional leader, because you're like, cool, I'm going to understand like where the company's at, the level of the role that's needed, the flavor, maybe it's one role, maybe it's two roles, and then help them hire in that so they get the right person, because otherwise they really are shooting in the dark, particularly if they've never had a head of people at all. They don't know anything about the space. So I think that can be, a really fantastic and low risk, de-risk the space incredibly, but also it means that they have a much higher chance of bringing in the right person and that person's going to have the support they need to thrive.
For our listeners, and maybe a big chunk of this is personal experience, it sounds so appealing to be in a mostly work from home, work with multiple clients, charge maybe a higher hourly rate than you would get in-house. But there are some real trade-offs. So from personal experience, I've been independent now for 8 years. Doing the work is the easiest part from my perspective. The admin, the operations, but even more so, like sales and marketing and business development, is not something that happens naturally for most HR people, including myself. And I've had to force myself to get noisy on LinkedIn. And even then, I'm not really stacking clients. People come to me in more of a kismet sort of way rather than me building a pipeline and generating work. So for every 10 people that think fractional and consulting is the way to go, there may only be one or two that, ends up having a smooth enough ride where they choose to keep doing it for a longer time. So definitely some trade-offs, at least from my perspective.
I totally agree, Andrew. And I think so much is about your network and your relationships. And actually, all my leads have come through network and relationship, not through website and not even through LinkedIn necessarily. And so I would say, like, how strong is your network? Do you have good relationships with VCs in particular, but also just with founders? I think once you kind of unlock that, if they had a good experience, they're going to refer you into other clients. It's interesting because, like, I'm new to this space. I've not even broadcasted that much, but I've had a lot of people reaching out and they're like, oh, I have somebody. Can you help with this? And can you help with that? And it's been interesting because I'm like at capacity, so referring the work on to my other fractional colleagues in the space. But yeah, you have to have that network. And I am not a BD person at all. And it was interesting because when I first did this, I was trying to be the BD person. I was trying to do like the pitches and the nice shiny decks. And it was a lot of work. And I didn't get the business because it's just not my style. And I don't know if that's how people make decisions. Whereas most recently, it was just like coffee conversations and like really detailed emails about what I was hearing from them, how I could help. I did 0 presentations. It was just all really focused on playing back what I heard and how I could add value and just getting really clear, I guess, on what I offer. The other thing is just in HR, you can be often a broad in terms of your skill set. And you're like, I can do it all. And you probably can, but there's certain things that you're really good at. And so I think what I focus a lot on is, what am I really good at, but also what does the market need? And so I spoke to my VC friends and I said, what are your pros coming to you for, like for people? And they said, here's the top 10. I'm like, cool. I can do 4 of those things like really well. And that's what I'm going to focus in on. And that was all the difference. So just speaking to what are their immediate needs. Now, what I put on paper and what they hired me in to do is a component, but not the full extent of what I do. So I think that's just been a little bit of a learning curve in terms of like actually define a few key things, because you want to be known for something so people know what to reach out to you for.
We all have a similar sales non-gene in us. Like, I don't really want to sell a thing here. But the most powerful things that I've learned about sales is really, it's more about listening and really trying to solve a problem for someone than it is like, look at me and all the shiny things that I have for you. And so I think that resonates a lot of how to build a business. And I think for almost the majority of people I've talked to who've gone off, and whether it's fractional or advisory or any version of like trying to start your own thing, like your network is really where that initial set of clients comes from. But I know for myself, like relationships, referrals, that has been a huge, huge part of my business as well. And so it's very much aligned with what you're bringing up here. You've worked across different geographies and organizational cultures. What's actually different when it comes to people leadership in Australian companies compared to maybe US-based tech or PE-backed ones?
Yeah, there's quite a big difference. One is the maturity of the startup ecosystem in Australia is vastly different. So I moved from Boston, which is, equivalent to SF in terms of vibrancy and maturity. But Australia is at least 10 years behind in terms of just the ecosystem. So they don't have as much VC capital. The funds are still a little bit more nascent. They've obviously had some great success with Canvas, the golden child, but there's not a lot of other like unicorns that have created this much larger ecosystem. There's less cash slushing around. What that means, first off, is a lot of companies stagnate at a certain size. They easily get you about 200 people, but that 200 to 500 is challenging. And then 500 plus is really much more rare. Airwalks is one of those that's on that journey, and as well as it's like a new unicorn. Australia is just way more regulated. There's way more regulation and compliance from an employment standpoint. And so it's much more traditional HR. So people often are looking at it from a risk lens rather than a how do we get the most out of our people and move fast lens, and that performance outcomes focus. So that's very different. When I first moved here, I was like, what do you mean? There's like just all these things you have to do and processes, and like, who cares? Actually, you have to care, because there are a number of independent bodies that you can get slammed with some huge fines if you're not careful. So for instance, Australia has the right to disconnect. That's a new legislation that came into play. You can get some big fines if you are in violation, and that's raised. They have these things called psychosocial hazards, and it's quite extensive. So psychosocial hazards, that can be stress related. It can be like lack of role definition. It can be overwork. It can be obviously your discrimination, bullying. It's huge. And so theoretically, you can get nailed for not being compliant in these areas. It just becomes a really different environment of managing risk. That's something I think I've learned probably more so in the last 3 years, is that your language that you use with executives here is from a risk lens. And that's very different than the US. And then if you want to do a riff, there is this whole song and dance that you need to go through in terms of process and notification and documentation and letters. And if you do not do these things to a T, you can get a claim raised against you. And so it is a very different environment that you have to navigate.
The employment regulatory environment sounds like it really, like it does not speak to the chaos of a venture-backed tech startup at all.
It's so different, but often you still get the same flavor of founders. So they're like, move fast. So then you end up being like, actually, we can't because of these reasons, or we're actually knowingly taking on more risk. The other thing is that directors have personal liability here. So they are can be personally held liable financially and criminally as well. So very different dynamic.
Teresa, do you think that environment translates to more power and influence in the HR role or less? We talk about not
Yeah.
wanting to be the compliance cops, and let's work
Yeah.
on helping our orgs be successful in meeting their goals and, revenue and growth. And by being tugged into the compliance and liability mitigation arena, does that help us or hurt us?
I think it limits HR, and that's why a lot of HR leaders actually never move out of the compliance space. They've grown up in that space. It's so critical to the business. They don't even realize that you can operate in a different way. So I would say it can sideline HR indefinitely if you only play in that space. And I would say, yeah, a lot of the HR leaders in Australia who have grown up in Australia and haven't experienced anything else, they just maybe don't know that it can be different.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would say it's not a strategic position to be in.
Now, I have to imagine that the way that you approach the work and your training and skill building with People Leader Accelerator and being part of that along the way sets you apart so that you can be more unique, adding value as that internal and now like external advisory management consultant. So that's kind of a special place to be.
It is special. I would say that some leaders are like, I just want compliance. What are you talking to me about business strategy? Why are you asking me about that? And that comes to that appetite and that belief from the leaders and from the CEO in particular.
I've heard somebody else who said, I'm like a peanut butter cookie. Some people really like peanut butter cookies. Some people don't really. Some people are allergic. Some people only want one. Some people could eat a whole box full. But I'm the peanut butter cookie. We're going to be really clear that I'm the peanut butter cookie. I'm not whatever flavor you want to show up. And we're going to have a really direct conversation about like, what do you need for your org right now? Is it a peanut butter cookie or is it chocolate chip or carrots?
I love that. For me, it's like I'm a problem solver first and foremost who happens to work in the people space. So I think it's like, do you want a problem solver who's going to really get into the business and understand how to remove organizational friction? Not everybody wants it. Sometimes people just want you to do the compliance thing. So yeah, great analogy.
Would love to share with our audience more of your wisdom in our accelerator round questions. So what are a couple of resources that you might recommend for our listeners to help them with their growth and learning journey?
I love Marcus Buckingham's 9 Lies About Work. It will just make you rethink every single people practice that we do. And it's very data driven. So it's like, actually, why do we do performance reviews? Why does engagement matter? What actually do people want from a one-on-one and from growth conversations? So that one is a favorite. The other one I read a few years ago is 4,000 Weeks by Oliver Burkeman. So it kind of is this premise of time management, but it's really around how we have limited time and this notion that if I'm just more efficient, I can do it all. Actually, you can't. And so to become really intentional about your trade-offs that you're making and how you're spending your time, and then what you let go of and what you're going to like underachieve in so that you can make sure you focus on the things that you care about the most. So those are probably my two.
What one sentence of advice would you share with folks who want to accelerate a successful HR career in today's environment?
I think you really understand your business first and foremost. And that means actually talking to the people on the ground. What do they do? What's day to day? What are the constraints? If you can speak the language of the business, that is going to unlock so much. And also to just be flexible.
And last but not least, for those who'd love to follow up with you after listening to this wonderful, insightful conversation, how can listeners reach out?
LinkedIn is the place. I'm always happy to have a chat.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us, especially at this early hour as we were able to enjoy the light.
The sun.
Yeah,
There it is.
rising over the window on the side. There were so many wonderful insights about fractional work. And I learned a lot about Australia too, that I was not expecting. So thank you. Thank you for joining us.
No worries. It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.